this trans women in women's sports, people make the same mistake over and over again. And that mistake is they give some kind of a statistics about male bodies, female bodies, hormones, height, arm reach, torso strength, whatever it is, they give some kind of and they're using it saying, look, I got you. Like, this is why trans women can't be in women's sports. But it's the same way with the crowd. They don't buy into that. So it's not a gotcha. It's not a persuasion. They believe trans women are women, and this is a moral issue.
For the wrong to rule, the good must just stand idly by.
Peter Boghossian is a writer, philosopher, and for me, one of the foremost thinkers of his age. Peter founded the non-profit National Progress Alliance and is a founding faculty fellow of the University of Austin. Peter burst onto the scene in 2018 with the Grievance Studies Affair, where he, along with James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, demonstrated that academic journals will take in 24-carat nonsense so long as it ticks all the right social justice boxes. After resigning from the University of Portland in September 2021, Peter became an even more celebrated intellectual in his own right, known across the world for his detailed critiques of wokeism and the regressive left. Among his many insights, Peter coined the term street epistemology, a means of discussing strongly held beliefs without confrontation, essentially finding out how people come to their conclusions without arguing, which I'm very much looking forward to talking to him about. This is my conversation with Peter Boghossian. Peter, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
Street epistemology, which is fascinating me. Can you explain to me what street epistemology is?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, and I'm delighted that you enjoy it. Street epistemology is a method of asking someone questions very gently that draws from the Socratic method as a base, and then it pulls from hostage negotiations, cult exiting, drug and alcohol counseling, etc. And it helps people figure out if the confidence they have for their beliefs matches the evidence for their beliefs. So street epistemology is a way to help someone become a gentle way to help someone become more humble about what it is that they think that they know.
So purely logistically, it's a set of lines on the street, and you have in the middle, you start with the position, and someone at the same time, people have to take a step forward or away from it.
Okay, so there are two types or many types of street epistemology. One is just street epistemology, like what I did with your kids last night. Yeah. And then the other is spectrum street epistemology, when you put people on a spectrum. So you put 7 lines of tape on a sidewalk with neutral in the middle, strongly disagree, slightly disagree, put people on the neutral claim, ask them a question, and they walk to a line. So you literally can see the physical manifestation of how they change their beliefs when they go from strongly disagree to slightly disagree or whatever. Sometimes people walk across the other end of the spectrum after just a few questions.
Really?
Yeah.
And so it's the point of it is to help someone understand what it is that they think and the level of the level of intensity with which they hold a certain belief.
Yeah, it's to help them calibrate their confidence. That's the primary purpose of it. But the secondary purpose is, and I do this all around the world, and I never know who's going to come to the lines and what they're going to believe. I have no idea because I've never seen anybody before. But in an ideal world, if I could wave a wand, I'd have somebody on the strongly agree, someone on the strongly disagree, and someone in the middle. And then I'd facilitate a conversation among the people, and then I'd see how they move. So I'd try to give them the gift of doubt by asking them questions.
Yeah. We did do it. We did it last night with the kids. It was quite interesting. And what's so brilliant about it is it seems so sort of hyper democratic that it works for everybody. And it's kind of it ups you don't really need to be massively intelligent to use it.
No, it's a way of asking people if they agree with themselves.
Right.
And it's a way of, it's not complicated to do. Anybody can do. And it either costs, $2, like £3, or it costs nothing. So I use lines of tape, but if you don't have money for lines of tape, you can use sticks or, you can place stones. Or chalk, you can write chalk, strongly disagree, neutral, and then put everybody in the neutral. And your job, if you facilitate this, is, in fact, the last question I ask people is, what line do you think I would be on? And the goal is to not have people should not know what line you'd be on. They should not know your beliefs. So you need to ask questions in such a way that you're not promoting or pushing an agenda. That's the only way it truly works. Like if people think you have an agenda, the integrity of the process is compromised.
But surely being curious and seeking truth makes you a far-right extremist anyway, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's not even the seeking the truth. Many people, and I have videos of people losing their minds at me, actually at one of the places in my former at Portland State University, and the other one is universities when people just literally go crazy at the very idea that somebody asked them a question.
Why is that? What's happening in the university?
Okay, so I'm about to find out how prevalent this is. I know from the Anglosphere, just in Sydney and Melbourne, and I did this in Hungary and Romania, all throughout the U.S. I haven't done it in the U.S. I'm going to do it in the U.S., in London in 2 days. But in the United States, people are seeking a reason to be offended. So they believe, so this is you told me your audience was very smart off camera,
Yeah.
so I'm going to give you the theoretical background for this. So they believe that there's something in the nature of asking questions. It's called privilege-preserving epistemic pushback. Privilege-preserving epistemic pushback is an idea from the literature that everybody wants to preserve their power. And right now in the society, whites, hetero, quote-unquote, cis people, educated, native speakers, et cetera, there's just a hierarchy of people who have privilege. When you ask questions, you're not asking questions to figure out what the case is or what someone thinks. You're asking questions for the sole purpose of preserving your power. So many people would object to this. The woke left in particular despise this. And they despise this because they're completely convinced they have the right answers to moral questions. And they believe that the very act of asking questions means that you just want to preserve your power.
So I've been mulling this idea that Joe Biden stands up and he says white supremacy all the time. So it's the biggest threat to America. And you're going, it's obviously not the biggest threat to America. Why is he saying it? And part of me thinks we're about to see a big redefinition of what white supremacy is. To say that what it is everything that we've known that's gone before in this sort of odd drive to Pol Pot year zero land. That white supremacy is going to be the law, anything to do with the law, anything to do with tradition and institutions, anything that basically we rely on as
to have a civil functioning society.
Yeah. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or is it out there?
Well, it just seems demonstrably false. You know, as Douglas Murray says, there's a lack of Nazis, so you just have to make them up. So you have to kind of say he's a Nazi. We have a Nazi shortage issue. So you have to kind of fabricate them everywhere. It would just seem demonstrably false on a number of levels, but clearly inflation, drug addiction, homelessness, it would be, and my friend Michael Schellenberger ran for governor, and those are the issues. Those are the issues that he trumpeted in his campaign. Those are the issues that people care about. And to say that it's white supremacy is not only, I don't want to say it's a lie, because that might mean that he knows, like that he's saying something he doesn't believe, and I don't have access to his inner life. So it might not be a lie per se, but it's such a stretch to the truth. So for example, when Black people, African Americans, attack Asian people, the claim is that they do so because they're participating in white supremacy.
The Black people who attack, because there's a weird stat, isn't there? The weird stats on Black and Asian violence certainly in America.
Yeah, and you absolutely cannot say that. So we've demeaned the truth overall. That's the other reason people don't like the Spectrum Street epistemology stuff. They don't like it because it doesn't forward a particular narrative. In fact, it doesn't work if it forwards a narrative. And so there are certain narratives that have to be forwarded. And again, the racial thing is far more of an issue in my country than it is in yours.
Well, we don't record it. So in the UK, they've only just started recording and publicising the ethnic background of a criminal. But what they do is they record the ethnic, the ethnic breakdown of the prison population and use that as a cudgel to say how racist the country is. Because if you don't record the crime, but you record the perpetrator, you go, there's far too many Black people in prison. Yeah.
Okay. So I just wrote the afterword to Matt Thornton's book, The Gift of Violence. And one of the things he says that's really interesting in that book is, so I'm going to tell you something that's a fact. You can dislike it, but this is just a fact, that men in general, and young men in particular, males, since no one knows what a man is.
What is a man?
Too complicated of a concept.
It is quite interesting to know why no one asks themselves what a man is. That is an interesting question.
Yeah. The Babylon Bee just had something about that recently. They said, what is a man? And someone said something, and then it was a 2-hour film, and then there were 2 hours. It was like, he said something for a minute, and there was almost 2 hours of credits rolling at the end. In other words, it's a very simple question to answer. But he said that men, young men in particular, I think it's between the ages of, this is out of my area, but I think it's between the ages of 16 and 26 or 29 or so. Young men are involved in radically disproportionate incidents of violence in society in relation to women. And so police have more contact with men than women because men commit more crime. But yet nobody says that the police are harboring some animus against men. Why would that be? I mean, police go into black neighborhoods not because they're racist, because that's where the crime is. That's why, as a general rule, police don't go into Asian neighborhoods as frequently.
Wouldn't it be important for society, though, in order to, because, obviously the stats on gun violence in America are,
ghastly.
It's something 7% of the population are committing 50% of the murders, for example. Now,
yeah, they're only from certain zip codes, and certain people are repeat offenders.
But right. Wouldn't one want to go, okay, if that's the issue, and let's not put it down to the fact that black people are inherently violent more than white people, wouldn't you want to have that piece of information so you could then get to the bottom of it? You go, maybe it's the Great Society, maybe it's the fact that, there aren't fathers around. Wouldn't it help solve?
Okay, so that's the other thing. So that you said you stuck something in at the very end that we have to talk about, but that's a separate issue. The 3 criminogenic factors, and this is out of my area, but since you mentioned it, 3 criminogenic factors are age, whether or not you're male. Most people know that, but the thing nobody wants to talk about is whether there's an adult male in the home. Okay, so let's bracket that for a second. So when you're talking about, and I initially did a lot of my work in the prisons, and I've been interested in this arena for a long time. Even if you had those stats, you would have the interpretation of those stats by people like Ibram X. Kendi, who will tell you that the sole source for the disparity, everyone says defining woke or critical social justice is so complicated. It's actually not complicated at all. It's one of the core principles is any disparity in outcomes is due to the system. It's not due to, in fact, not only is it not due to culture, you can't even consider culture. And you certainly couldn't consider any genetic predilection to whatever one would want to claim. Heather McDonald has a new book on that. She's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute.
Race Trumps Merit. I can't wait to read that.
It is mind-blowing. Her last book, The Diversity Delusion, was fantastic.
Amazing. I got all those stats from that book. She's brilliant at it.
Yeah, so one of the things that I learned that was fascinating from having a conversation with her, you should have her on our show.
I had her on the other day and on GB News.
She's a firecracker.
She's just so brave as well to be able to say what she says.
So I'll run with the conversation in my own thing. So one of the things I've been thinking about is why recently, what are the reasons that people who are not caught in the orbit of the ideology, why do they demean merit? Like, I understand people who are proponents of whatever you want to call it, wokeism, critical social justice. Like, I get it. I get it. I understand. They think that the systems are at fault. I got it. But why would someone who doesn't know anything about it, why would they demean something that's absolutely not only necessary, but utterly indispensable for the functioning of civil society? Why? And she told me, and I never thought about this before, she told me it's because people don't understand the degree of the disparities. And she rattled off the statistics. Do you know what the SAT is? Do they have that here?
Yeah. She was. I was listening to her and Victor Davis Hampton talk about it. But it's
basically a standardized test that you take, and the racial disparities are unbelievable. And she told me that it's because people think that the degree of the disparity is trivial, and if they really understood the degree of the disparity, there's no way that they would go along with it.
Expand that more. So what we're essentially saying is when you look at black kid, his SATs, how good he is at maths or something like that, and it's a huge disparity between him and, say, an Asian kid or something.
Yeah, an Asian or an Ashkenazi Jew.
Yes, Ashkenazi Jews did quite well there, didn't they? You know.
I have a friend, a buddy of mine who's Jewish, and I asked him, funny thing to say, I asked him what he thought about that whole chosen people stuff. He's like, yeah, I completely believe Jews are the chosen people, but chosen for what?
Well, who knows? Who knows in the direction that we're heading?
Yeah, I know. It's terrifying.
Unbelievably
terrifying.
I was listening to Heather McDonald and talking to Victor Davis Hanson the other day, and she has really ramped up she's starting to say, you know, identity politics has got to be played now in response to what's going on, because the sort of demonization of and using melanin, skin color, to sort of really put people down, that she's saying you to protect your culture, you've got to start saying, I actually do believe some of these structures that were built by white men are good. I mean, what do we think?
Yeah. So, you know, Glenn Lowry has a great bit on that. He's also at the University of Austin, and he talks about how this is a lack of dignity for black people. There's just simply, part of the problem, Laurence, is that the first step to solving any problem is that you have to be honest about it. And if you're not honest about your problems, you're simply not going to solve them. And to rule out culture as an explanation. So I just tweeted something the other day about a New York Times headline said that only 7% of African Americans, I think his Stuyvesant School, got admitted to this high school. But I quote tweeted it, and someone said, yeah, you can look at it like that, but you can also look at it like, why is it that Asians are 2% of the population, depending how you define it, but they're responsible for 64% of the admissions? And, you know, what is about Asians that we need to emulate? And going back to Heather McDonald's point, that was interesting. And I say we as kind of a goal, right? What are they doing what is in their culture that allows them to succeed? And we know Amy Chu and others have the Curse of the Tiger Mom, et cetera, have written pretty extensively about this. And we know from how long people study, we know, I mean, this is not a mystery, but the idea that you would just completely remove any possibility of culture and blame it on systems, and as a consequence of that, you need to dismantle or disable the system, that isn't only dishonest, that's wrong. But what's even worse than that is if somebody calls that into question, you call them a racist or a bigot or a homophobe. And it doesn't even have anything to do with homosexuality, but you just throw that in the whole suite of slurs. So you have multiple problems operative at the same time. But the core problem is we have to have the ability to speak openly and honestly about things. And there are very few ways to do that. One of the ways to do that is through spectrum street epistemology. It's like what I mentioned last night. Don't give your opinion, just ask questions, right? And so people are much more likely to engage that. But if we have a kind of cultural sickness now where any kind of questioning is viewed as a microaggression, or they need a safe space, or you know, when I do some of this, real quick, I'm talking a lot, but when I do some of those, last time I did those in Portland State, they offered the adults, the college students, coloring books and cotton candy.
So I can't cope with it anymore because it's so crazy. But university, obviously, you said, you know, it's stopped using the Socratic method to break things down and right, you know, explore ideas. Why is it still going on now that we all know that it's going on, and no one in their right mind would think that that's a great way of educating people? And why is it getting worse? Okay, so no one in their right mind would think that's a great way to educate people. You know, to promote ideology.
But the people who are promoting the ideology thinks it's a fantastic. They're turning the institutions into madrasas. Yeah, and they have offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion that are weaponized against heretics and blasphemers. So if they don't like, even the threat of being investigated by the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or whatever they call global diversity or global equity or what have you, global belonging, even the threat of that limits the things that you're willing to say because you don't want to be investigated. So why is it going on? We have people who have jobs for life. We can talk about idea laundering if you want. That's another thing. We have a system in place in which there are offices in search of tasks looking, and not only global offices of diversity, there are these other things called bias response teams. Anybody can call the bias response team. Great article a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal by Julian Melchior about this. Anybody can call into the bias response team, and it can be anonymous. And you can even they bypass traditional academic structures. They're records in general that are stored with the police. And you can even get called to the bias response team for thought crimes, for like thinking something. If you think that somebody else thinks something, then you can file a record there. So we have so you want to know what system? That actually is a system.
Well, it's like, it feels like the Peter Thiel calls them kind of non-jobbers, doesn't it?
Right.
So it's almost like you've got a blood system, which is the traditional system. You've got your and then you've got the sort of lymphatic system, and the lymphatic system is just full of this stuff. But is that not communism? Are we sort of in?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, James Lindsay and my writing partner, James Lindsay, with New Discourses and other, we'll call it, Jordan Peterson calls a type of communism or neo-Marxism. But I do want to say, to be clear, I agree that there is systemic racism, and it's systemic racism against Asians, and that's been borne out again and again by the courts. At Harvard, for example, you need higher SATs, higher tests, even in graduate school. A very small percentage. It's going to sound like I'm an Asian supremacist here, but I'm just telling what the data.
The fact supremacist.
A very small percentage of the population responsible for 20% of the graduating class in STEM at elite or Ivy League universities, and so there is a crisis of confidence in the system. I've been writing about this for years. There's a legitimacy crisis in the media, in the academy, across every sector of the society, industry, but the origination point of that is in the academies. That's where it started. That's where they get these deranged ideas. That's where they're taught this stuff is truth, and that's how it metastasizes into the larger society.
What's idea laundering?
Let's say those guys and I have an idea about something. We want to say that, I don't know, Perrier, whatever the water I'm drinking now, I don't want to, whatever water I'm drinking now is great. So it's a good water to drink. And I maybe I casually mentioned it to him, and he's like, yeah, that's a great water. And I'm in the academy. I have a professorship somewhere. He's trying to get tenure somewhere, which is a job for life. And we come up with this idea that we're gonna make a journal. We're gonna make a journal about why this water is so good. And so we have a moral. So I'm just using water, but ideally it would be about some moral thing, like not eating meat, for example. That's much better, but it's tricky when you start talking about moral things because then it's hard to disassociate. So let's stick to the water. So he has an idea. I have an idea. We all have an idea. We make a journal. I become the editor. He's the assistant editor. He's the reviewer. And then we solicit articles. But we only take articles that forward the narrative that we're trying to forward, that forward the conclusion that we started with. So just like money laundering, and that they used to say it in New York, because it's a laundry machines, the mafia would go in, they'd launder it, it would be dirty money, and they would come out clean. Idea laundering is you have a moral impulse, you wash it through a journal, and it comes out as knowledge. And then you point to that article that's in a journal as evidence for whatever public policy you want to implement. Okay, you want to hear something that's like next level dastardly?
Yeah.
Okay, this is this is really important. If you want to figure out why society has been consumed by madness, this is what you have to know. Every woke word has two meanings. It's called a Motte and a Bailey. The Motte is the castle. It's very easy to defend. The Bailey is very difficult to defend. And then I'm going to explain how woke spreads to the Anglosphere, if this is of interest to you.
Real interest, yes.
Yeah, and then I'm going to explain how it's more difficult to spread out of the Anglosphere and how it still spreads. So let's take the word inclusion. So if I say to a person who's not been indoctrinated into the ideology, if I say to them, what does inclusion mean? What would they say?
They would say that people are taking part in an activity together.
Yeah. Black people, fat people, short people, people in wheelchairs. Every sane person would want inclusion. Every sane person would want that, right?
Yeah.
That's the Motte. The Bailey, I'm going to run through the argument with you. You want people to be included, right? I want people to be included. But, well, to be included, that means that people feel welcome, right? Right? I mean, that's what inclusion means, that they feel welcome in a space they enjoy. But, if somebody were to say something that would make someone feel unwelcome, then they wouldn't feel included.
Oh, God.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So to have an inclusive space, we need to restrict speech. That's the Bailey. That's what goes in public policy documents. The Bailey. But that only works in English. Okay? So let me throw this out. It's not that woke won't work in any other language, but it's that right now, I wrote a piece for The Spectator about this. It's that right now, English is the language of woke. However, when you translate a word into another language, only the Motte translates. The Bailey does not translate. So if you translate inclusion into another language, it would be something like, everybody should participate, be welcome to participate. Everyone should have the ability to participate in a conversation in a public space. But the Bailey doesn't translate.
Because it's modified in some way.
Yeah, so the way that woke works is it has to keep the English meaning of the word. That's why when you watch videos of people who have been educated at places like Harvard, I just wrote the forward to a book a few months ago called Snakes in the Ganga, with Indian public intellectual Rajiv Malhotra. And he talks about wokeism as a neo-colonial export from the United States to Indian universities. And there are videos of people in Hindi, whatever, Punjabi, whatever, diversity, equity. And when I was in Europe a few months ago, you saw it, people have, I was in Austria, and then diversity. And there'll be, and I had long conversations with many lawyers who, when I went before, they said, this will never come here. And I told them exactly how it would enter. It would enter through English. And sure enough, at a talk, a guy apologized to me because he had stood up before and said, that's not true. It's never going to come. But it comes through English. And the only reason it comes through English is because in the translation in a native language, it only translates the primary meaning of the word. So that's how wokeism spreads.
That's amazing. What I don't understand is that because we're just too affluent with our lives, and we're just too sort of, everything is so easy and free now that you can actually spend time to give a word a Bailey, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I can posit why that is.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I don't know why that is, but it would just be conjecture if I said why it is.
Yeah.
The important thing here is to understand the mechanism for the spread of the ideology. And the bottom line is that people have been bamboozled. They've been hoodwinked by the meanings of words. Equity is a great example of that. And Ibram X. Kendi just rewrote a section of his book. People have been calling my friend Chris Rufo calls it a victory. I don't think it's a victory. The line was, the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, right? So he just rewrote that. That's not rewriting it. That's the honest, he's actually being honest. That's the definition of equity. So
it's revenge, essentially, in a funny way. I've sat down with someone the other day. I was interviewing him for another show, and he basically said to me, his argument for immigration into the UK was the fact that we went and our ancestors went.
That's equity.
That's it.
That's an equity-based argument.
Yeah.
Correct.
But that is so anti-meritocratic when the whole,
by definition,
it's the opposite of meritocratic.
It has to be. So let me let me give folks who participate in the ideology the bone they're looking for. I'm going to give them something. Yes, it is 100% true that there have been historical horrors. There's just simply no question about it, undeniable. Those are not features of race. Those are found across the world in every culture and every, I mean, I'm Armenian. My ancestors were, they fled to the United States during the genocide. It's happened all around the world. It's currently happening today. I hate to say it, with the Uyghurs, etc. But we can again bracket those things. And for too long, what we have not done, I'll speak for people in the United States, is we have not given citizens of the United States what they would deserve, and that's equality. We've not given them a public education of the first rate. We've not given them conditions to enable them to thrive and flourish and prosper in society, just like anybody else, independent. There's no reason, in my opinion, if you're a young person and your parents aren't together, and sorry if I'm getting emotional, and you don't have enough money, that you should be denied a medical procedure. It's utterly inexcusable, And so people are pissed now, and they're demanding equity. But part of the problem, bracketing for a second, that solution does not accomplish what you think it's going to accomplish.
The opposite.
It does. But leaving that aside, one of the consequences of that is you still don't have equality. We still have failing schools in Black neighborhoods. BLM was a disgrace. It was a lie. And so how are we, the whole defund the police movement, in my own city of Portland, the number of African-American men went up dramatically. People suspect it's called a mass Ferguson effect, where people don't police Black neighborhoods. And the consequence, because they don't want to be called racist, and the consequence of that is we have more young dead Black men. And what we need to be doing, we need to be honest about the nature of our problems. We need to work not towards equity, and I can give you a reason for that, why I'm interested, but we need to work toward equality, where everybody has an opportunity to succeed, and they have public schools of the first rate. A lot of these kids, in some place in Detroit, they bring their own toilet paper. That's disgraceful. Or they don't have access to good food in the home. We should be providing them, this is my opinion, you can take it for what it's worth, we should be providing a social net for them so they get good 2 square meals a day in school, and not those little crappy pizzas in the tin boxes, like eggs, etc.
But does it, I think absolutely, in an ideal world. I suppose we've had a state-funded, taxpayer-funded health service in this country since 1948. And what happens is, it's absolutely right. Everyone is free at point of care. That's how it should be. But what's happened is, because it's essentially a forced socialist institution in a way, it just is, it's now useless. I mean, it is pretty useless now. Cancer care is, what happens is they just get more and more and more managers to come up with ideas, and less frontline health servants, health staff. So we're now, what are we, 32 or 16, what is it, in the world for health outcomes in the West, developed countries. Anyway, it's plummeting. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, yes, but how sturdy? Obviously, you want a very sturdy net, so that no one falls through it. But is there an argument to say that if you create these structures like health services, that they will essentially, because they're unnatural, they will start to sort of tumor, metastasize it? Yeah,
that's part of Weber's argument. Other people have talked about the inherent trajectory towards bureaucratization, where the whole institution becomes bureaucratic. Let me throw this out as a way to think about the problem. Yes, it could be something in the structure of our institutions, particularly in capitalism, or if you want to call it late capitalism. There could be something in the structure of our institutions that necessarily orients and promotes that trajectory. But bracketing that aside, I think you should just think about it from a humane situation. A child should never, ever be denied care because their parents are poor or separated or divorced or an alcoholic or something. I don't want to live in that society. That's utterly inexcusable. And so the consequence of that should not be equity. So, for example, the consequence, bracketing the whole vaccine thing. So, for example, the initial, it started the pandemic. You had an equity-based healthcare system, whereas African Americans got the vaccine first, right? And so you looked at people on the basis of an identity characteristic, an immutable characteristic, and then you forwarded or privileged that over people whose ancestors had not been oppressed. So once you start doing that, you're in trouble. But I think that's important to talk about. We should talk about that. But I also want to talk about what kind of society do we want to live in? For example, I have been blown away when I am here, and I've said this to some English people, and they just, I don't know, it doesn't go through. But no offense, but I've been blown away by how people treat the commons here.
What do you mean?
Just the subways, the subways, the buses, they're clean. Nobody's defecating on them. There's no violence. Like when I lived in Hungary for 4 months last year, they don't have plastic laminates over the advertisements. They're just paper. Just the way that people, there's no trash on the ground. Just the way that people treat, there's no tragedy of the commons. That's not the right phrase. That's a phrase from Gary Hart in 1956. But there's no kind of looking at a system and saying, oh my God. So my buddy and I, who's the president of Street Epistemology International, we go all around the world and we do these street epistemology videos. And I'm telling you, my theme is like, why can't we have nice things? America is just in decline. The homelessness, the drug addiction, the tent camping. When you see the tent camping, that's it. That's the death throes of the society. Inflation's bad everywhere, but the crisis of confidence in our institutions, and to then push that off and say that somehow that is white supremacy. The idea is that you have some kind of a systemic problem, right? And so that's why every disparity in outcomes has to be, you have to look at the system as a response. But commensurate with that, you have to change the meanings of the ordinary words, or make neologisms, which is combining two words, or...
I hate neologism.
Yeah, you have to make so for example, we've moved from minorities to minoritize. We've moved from, when I was a kid, it was a bum. Did you have that term here?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'd have bum tramps, we call them here.
Yeah, like people who are, yeah. So, okay, so let's look at just this one trajectory of a word. Bum. If you're a bum, that's an evaluative and a descriptive word. You're making an evaluation of the moral character of a person, and you're saying the person doesn't want to work. That's what a bum is. Then we move from bum to homeless. Homeless is a description of a person. It's not an evaluation. Fred is homeless. Fred is a person without a home. You don't even need a syllogism. Yeah. Then we've moved to houseless. Houseless is very different. If you are houseless, that is, you have been victimized by the system.
That's clever, isn't it? Because homeless and houseless are I didn't think about that, but I've heard AOC talk about it all the time, and it's basically going, you're being denied a fundamental human right, which is a house.
So all of that is a move towards the system. So then when you say when Joe Biden says this, there's this white supremacy is a large problem, he's talking about institutions in general and legacy institutions in particular that have embedded notions in the power structure of white supremacy. And as Helen Pluckrose, the lead author of Cynical Theory, says, you can have a system in which you can have a vast conspiracy in which there are no conspirators. So it's something in the system itself, even if nobody believes the tenets or the precepts of the system.
Could it be, this is what I sort of think, late stage capitalism? Yeah, in my view, I think capitalism is probably finished, as far as I can tell, because I don't know how well, no, because I think if governments are getting corporations to impose, the woke stuff on everybody. Yeah, all of that, ESG, what is it, CEI, and then the DI, but no one would ever vote for woke policies. No one would do it. So in America, certainly, yeah, they actually would. 8% of the people would, but it's not a 51-49 voting issue. So if governments won't vote for it, that corporations will do what governments won't do, then essentially it doesn't matter whether you're offended by Budweiser, because whoever the big corporations are, whoever the big investment funds are, like BlackRock and stuff like that, they just go, they short Budweiser. You're offended by Budweiser? Fine. I'll buy the other beer stock in the other beer company. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't. So I do know what you mean. I don't think that would cause the demise of capitalism. So that phrase has been around since the well, at least the 70s or mid 80s too. Remember Habermas is Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher who reconstructed Marx, kept talking about late capitalism. And I found it to be a really interesting phrase. I think that first of all, let me just say, I love the West. I love the Enlightenment tradition. I do not believe that everything the society has built, the greatest societies of all time, and I don't just mean militarily great or economically great, I mean the greatest societies in terms of values, free speech, enlightenment, liberalism, in terms of the ability for people to lead their own lives, the ability for people to assemble, have free press. And yeah, we've stumbled along the way, and there have been some, stains. But I think that I agree with Martin Luther King, I think that the moral arc has been towards justice. And I don't see that when I say late capitalism, like if you look at the Socialist Party platform in the United States in 1912, it was very similar to many of the progressive policies that have been adopted today. So I think as a society, the United States has kind of tended toward, in general, left-wing economics and socialist policies. I personally think that that's a good thing in terms of affording people a safety net. I don't think that, but that's another conversation. But when we say late capitalism, I do see one, for example, I'm only speaking in the United States now, 1/3 of the total tax money that's come in has gone to pay the interest on the debt. And that's why recently the Republicans and Democrats had a disagreement on raising the debt ceiling. Okay, that is unsustainable. That is just simply absolutely unsustainable, especially if you want to talk about carrying the military that we're currently carrying, which I've also had a shift of mind on.
Why have you shifted on Ukraine? Well, this is crazy. I don't understand why no one's allowed to talk about the Ukraine war as well. That's sort of shut down. That you go, America is in a proxy war with Russia, essentially. Is that correct? And also, why has no one given us, the demos, told us what the objective of the war in Ukraine is? Surely to have a good military campaign, you need to go, our objective is what? To go back to the Donbass line? Which one is it? No one says. It's just like, here, have $150 billion. And we overpaid you by 3, by the way.
Yeah, I find that situation utterly heartbreaking on so many levels. But I have something resonant in my head that you were talking about. So we have so many problems in the United States now. And as I see it, one of the fundamental problems is that our tools of analysis and our ability to solve those problems are being robbed from us. They're being systemically stripped. That actually, again, is a systemic fake. And the system is the American academies, the institutions. They're all ideal, almost all of them, if not. Certainly, it depends on the department. All of the departments, anything that ends in studies has been ideologically captured. It's complete corruption. And then out there, the humanities, and it's less in STEM field else. But even in STEM fields, I can't remember the number of universities people have to sign diversity statements. They have to show how they work for diversity. The citations in peer-reviewed articles called citation justice should be forwarded by people whose ancestors had historical oppression variables, which is deranged. But bracketing that, so we have an internal enemy right now in the United States that's operating on American soil, that's exporting woke madness to the rest of the world. And it pains me as an American to come and sit in another country and say that.
But at least you're saying it, which is great. But if we've infantilized, what this is, as they say, you're limiting speech by saying it offends people with microaggression. If you're infantilizing an entire generation, an educated generation, if they lose that knowledge, which they lost it now, how do they get it back? That's what I mean. It's like, once you've infantilized someone and made them thick, a lot of these people are thick. You speak to them, and you see their face suddenly change if you go, I didn't like the Gillette advert, by the way. How do you maintain the passage of knowledge through the academy if the academy has stopped providing it?
Every generation has to not relearn. Galileo said, I stood on the shoulder of giants. It's not that they have to relearn. but they have to have a fundamental understanding of this, of the principles that got them, for historical principles, scientific principles, educational principles. I would argue there are two ways. One, it's through epistemology. I think it's a way of asking people questions that help them align their beliefs with reality. The other one, frankly, is narrative. And within narrative, it's just basically, with stories. I'm doing this thing. The only reason I'm here is I'm doing something with John Cleese, and he looks at everything through humor. And he thinks one of the ways to change the moral mind is through humor. And so that's what we're really talking about. We're not. So here's what I learned from doing those exercises where I put people on the sidewalk. People will stand on the line, whatever line, strongly agree, slightly agree, not because they have evidence, sufficient evidence that they've calibrated and thought about, but they stand on the line because they think, here's the syllogism, I am a good person, good people stand on this line, I'm going to stand on this line. So people will make decisions based upon their moral impulses of what it means to be a good person. And that's part of the problem with woke. Part of the problem with woke is when you take the tools away from someone to critically analyze or evaluate a position, what are they left with, right? So think about this for a second. Say that on that scale, say I say to you, you want to say whatever, immigration. And I say, do you think, I'm just making this up. I'll use him. So he says, we need, 1 million more immigrants in this country by 2026. And I say, how confident are you in that on a scale from 1 to 10? With 10 being positive, 9 being virtually positive, 5 being maybe, 1 being I don't believe it. So let's say that he says he's an 8. Anything above the number 8 that he gives, his evidence is now not calibrated correctly to the confidence in his belief. So he will have to do something to make up the difference between the evidence he has and his confidence. That could be being offended, saying a swear. I don't know if I can swear.
You can certainly swear.
Saying fuck you, walking away. It can be, but if he had evidence, he wouldn't need to do any of that. He would just present the evidence.
Yeah.
So when they're out of alignment, something has to make up that slack. So you asked a great question, and that is, what do we do with an entire generation of people who don't have the dialectical tools, the communication tools? What do you do with an entire generation of people who were taught to not engage with ideas that they find offensive or objectionable? You have inculcated a sense of epistemic and cognitive frailty. So how do we teach people or help people value those things? And my answer to that would be, again, it's a moral value. You can either do it through narrative or through street epistemology. But if you don't do that, you risk ultimately corroding the very institutions that we have built from the Enlightenment. There's no other way. I mean, how else would you do it? Because so the mission of the institutions would be the same, but the people who would discharge those missions would have deranged ideas about the world that are completely untethered to reality. So how can our institutions, how can we function as a society? There's no way we can function as a society.
Well, is that why it's getting worse? Because as you say, the difference between there and there, if it's not epistemological and it is all emotional based, when you're at an 8, everyone would have to take the decision that immigration is a good thing. It's an emotional decision. You go, these poor people, they need to come into the country. We've got a nice country. Let people in. Right. You lose the other argument. So therefore, I wonder if that's why the oppression Olympics is getting worse, and why everyone always wants to be at the front of the woke charge, don't they? Everyone's always sort of upping their game, getting a little bit more and more and more woke. But where does that lead? So you watch the university get destroyed. Everyone is furious. They come out into life. There's no jobs.
Well, how could there be? There couldn't be, because they destroyed this. The Chinese aren't playing this game.
They love meritocracy in China, don't they? They work the hell out of it.
The Gaokao, which is the high school test that people take.
Did you see this Chinese ship go across the front bow of the American ship just the other day? No. It made it stop. It just refused to change course. And I think that's a very big statement by the Chinese to go, you stop your boat, little Americans, with your rainbow pride drag shows on military bases, which finally got cancelled.
So that's the other thing. I'm glad you mentioned that. So once wokeness or critical social justice or critical theory, or however you a successor ideology, as Wesleyan calls it, or regressive leftism, as Majid, whatever you want to call it, we'll just say wokeism or critical social justice. Once that gets in, it's a universal solvent that destroys everything it touches. So once it gets in the military, by definition, because of what it does, it upends the meritocracy. Once it gets in, it corrupts the very mission of the institution. And so the institution cannot discharge its primary mission, which is to defend the United States and our allies. It can no longer do that because it's been hijacked.
And then you find that all the people that traditionally went to die won't join the military anymore because they're told that they're white supremacist racists by General Milley. I find that you're right. It is like a universal solvent. It completely, any sort of meritocratic hierarchical institution is game over. So obviously you can't see the future, but if you had to sort of use logic, reason, evidence, common sense, all of these things, and your knowledge, what would you say we're heading towards, if anything?
Fall out of the sky. Anything that's not based, anything that's merit-based, the moment you start letting people, the medical profession, the moment you start letting people into those professions, someone will suffer. There's no two ways about it. And I do want to say something before I give my prediction. I try to be optimistic, but before I give that, I just want to say that it's just so important to understand, and we just released a video about this. It's so important to understand that people who believe these things, there's no gotcha, because there's only a gotcha if you believe something that someone else believes. So say, for example, I came in here, for example, and I ate a bacon sandwich, and this guy over here is freaking out, hey, Boghossian, why are you eating bacon? In the Quran, it says, some surah don't eat bacon. I think there are 4 surahs, if memory serves me correctly, pronounced, don't eat bacon. But anyway, he says, why are you eating bacon? And he pulls out the Quran. He's like, but I'm not a Muslim, so I don't buy into the system. So it's only a gotcha. If I were a Muslim, like, oh man, I shouldn't eat bacon. But it's only a gotcha if you buy into the system. So if you don't buy into the idea that we should formulate our beliefs on the basis of reason and evidence, as Sam Harris says, there's no amount of reason and evidence that would cause you to accept the fact that you need reason and evidence to formulate your beliefs. And let me give you an example of that. So this trans women in women's sports, people make the same mistake over and over again. And that mistake is they give some kind of a statistics about male bodies, female bodies, hormones, height, arm reach, torso strength, whatever it is, they give some kind of and they're using that saying, look, I got you. Like, this is why trans women can't be in women's sports. But it's the same way with they don't buy into that. So it's not a gotcha, it's not a persuasion. They believe trans women are women, and this is a moral issue. And what you identify with in terms of your gender is it. So there is no evidence that could come in. Okay, so I'm saying that because we have trained a generation of people to move from thinking about the world in terms of discourse and maybe debate. I'm not a big fan of debate. I much strongly prefer conversation because people can change their mind. You're not tenaciously held to believe, but you're moving them from evidence and reason and rationality and being trustful of reason and being willing to revise their beliefs. You're moving them from that to the unshakable conviction they have in their own lived experience. And once you start talking about that, you're opening an extraordinarily dangerous way of life that people are almost forced to participate in.
And that they will defend so much stronger than they would something. An argument based on evidence and reason, as you quite rightly say, it lives between someone like that, doesn't it? And you push a little bit, you pull a little bit, you learn. It's the reason and debate is so important to increase knowledge. But emotion, moral conviction is terrifying.
So that's why, for me personally, I'm not upset at all. In fact, I rather enjoy, and I think everybody else should engage people with whom they disagree. And so if someone is a far-right capital, it doesn't matter where someone is in the political, as long as they're willing to present their argument, to listen, and to engage. I don't really think it makes any difference what they believe.
And it detoxifies what they believe as well, because I'm happy to speak to anybody about anything, the same as you. And actually, I think it's lovely. I quite like disagreeing with people too. I enjoy it. Yeah. But this isn't what's happening with these guys.
No, it isn't. And the other thing that's just heartbreaking about this is that it makes it so that somebody's access to truth is limited by an immutable characteristic.
Which is kind of discriminatory and racist if you think about it in a way.
Not only is it discriminatory and racist, it is the intentional creation of tragedy.
Wow, that's a really interesting way of putting it. The intentional creation. That's fucking amazing, though. The intentional creation of tragedy. That's exactly what I think, which ties into what I was trying to say was, is it because we live in a world where you can go on your phone and have food delivered to your house in 5 minutes and, you know, you're on your iPhone, everything is so easy that you need to intentionally create tragedy to give your life meaning? Where there was real tragedy, you know.
If you want your life to have meaning, you have to take on more responsibility, particularly responsibility as it's outwardly oriented. But when you make this shift from anything objective to anything subjective, you're just going to mire in your. That's why the woke people, they don't like competition. That's why they don't like hierarchy. That's why they don't like merit. Right? And it's impossible as a consequence for anybody to objectively adjudicate positions that people hold who are outside the system.
How do they relate to each other? Because I don't hang around with that many white people. They avoid me.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to the Ouroboros, the snake that eats its own tail from the Greek. Right? So ideological conformity, lockstep. But there is something in the relationships. It is a profound sense of community for those who adhere to the principles. So you get, that's the only thing people want more than to not belong. Everybody wants to be loved. Everybody wants to belong. And you're offered a community, a morally motivated ideological community. You're offered a community who loves you and who respects you, and you just spout the vicissitudes, the platitudes of the community, and you do virtue signaling, et cetera. You go through the trappings of the community, and then you get rewarded based upon how vocal you are in social media, et cetera. But you could substitute that with almost anything. But I will say one thing, this is my hobby horse. I think that is not fully illusory, but it's illusory. And the reason I think that is because communities that are based upon merit will always be intrinsically, it will create and forge relationships which are more real. I'll give you an example. So I do jiu-jitsu very seriously, right? And so I go around the world, I bring my uniform. I train with these guys here, Roger Gracie, he's like this world champion. If somebody has a black belt around their waist in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I can assure you this is not a man to be trifled with.
I will take your word for it.
Certainly invite you or these guys all in a row. We'll line them up and we'll see what will happen. But the idea is that there's something real. It's like speaking a foreign language. It's like playing an instrument. There's something real there. There's something about which one can be wrong about, but there's a process. It's not mystical. It's not metaphysical. There's a process that one can do. And if you devote yourself long enough and you're thoughtful when you do it, you will achieve a certain outcome. So when that's predicated upon something that's real, the relationships that you form with people, when they're based upon, well, Aristotle will call it a virtue, but when they're based upon something that's real, those relationships will be more profound. And I would argue, my own personal opinion is that they'll be more life enriching.
100%, because they ground you. You're great. As you say, if you sit there and learn Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and you get to the point where you've got a black belt, you've concertedly done something to the point of being this good at it. Therefore, that gives you meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you don't have to lie. You don't have to lie to yourself about what you believe. You don't have to pretend to believe anything. Belief is totally irrelevant.
So I want to touch on one more thing, but we've got to have to be careful because I fucking hate YouTube's stuff on this. Yeah. Have they gone has it gone too far now? And is the transgender movement an example of this ideology could it be pushed back by this? Is this moment the moment where they've just gone way too far? And are they linked essentially to wokeism and transgender?
This is our point of disagreement, and I know a lot of people who disagree with me about this, and I'm gonna tell you my thoughts. I think that once somebody is 18, they should have complete sovereignty over their own body.
I agree with that. Yeah, I still think it's an unbelievable tragedy that someone would take healthy tissue, but I think you should be able to do whatever you want.
It's not up to me to tell anybody how to live their lives.
No.
As a result, I'm not going to be the dictator. I'm a huge fan of cognitive liberty. I want people to believe anything they want to believe. I want to have the opportunity to engage them. If they want to tell me to fuck myself because I'm engaging them, they have every right to do so. People need the freedom to believe and to act in ways in which they think leads to their own flourishing. And if somebody is 18 and they want to undergo top surgery or bottom surgery, they not only should they have every right to, who should pay for it is a different question.
Yes.
That's a different question. But they should have every right to do so and not be discriminated against. We're going to bracket sports and such for the moment. When somebody is 18 is the key in that sentence. And so I'm sure it's been said, it has been said 1,000 times before, we don't allow children to get tattoos. We don't allow, I don't know, you don't have guns so much in this country, but we don't allow them to buy guns. You can't go into the military at 12. You can't. So there are reasons, very, very, very good reasons for that. We know that people get their tattoos removed, right? So we know that there's an element that people think they've made mistakes. So I would draw the line at 18, and as in every conversation, if someone chooses to live a life as the opposite gender or whatever gender they want, they should be welcomed in society without being discriminated against. The line is 18.
I agree with you 100%. Much as I think conservatives are quite clever now, the Matt Walshes as well, saying, but where is the brain at 25 and all of this sort of stuff. But
it's irrelevant where the brain is. The difference.
Isn't it what the bit that I find tragic about this, and this is where when my little right-wing wokery, if such thing exists, is that they're using a very, this is a community where suicide rates are very high, depression is very high, mental, things like autism very high. All of this is very, very high, and the little fuckers are using that community, and it went from Me Too, then to race, and you can understand because there are racial issues in the world, but to go to a community of someone who would actually turn around and go, the only way I can be happy is by, I just think it's so cruel. And
I throw something out too. I'm going to give you what we're looking for. It's cruel, and you have to remember there are manufactured lines of literature supporting this insanity. So people think this is why intellectual diversity is so important in the academy. People think, with the academy, the university system, peer review system, etc. People think that they're formulating their beliefs on the basis of the best available evidence because these peer-reviewed journals, these articles, have the imprimatur of knowledge. So they think that they're doing the right thing. They're not doing the right thing because they're been idea laundered.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So part of the problem is if you want to you cannot understand this problem unless you truly understand two things. One that I said before, which is the role of the university in all this. The university is the source of the madness. And two, the fact that these are not, as Steven Pinker says, the badness comes not because they're knowingly doing bad things. Socrates says that people don't knowingly do bad things. I've been thinking about that for over a quarter of a century. They do things based upon the evidence that they have. And the evidence that they have right now is that this is a good thing. And the problem is that it is incredibly difficult. So it's the moral fashion, right? That's morally fashionable right now. It's incredibly difficult to get articles published that are not morally fashionable. We talked about the social stuff, the agreement style stuff. And somebody trying to bring attention to that is not a bad person. They want to to give the system integrity so that we have bodies of knowledge and literature that we can rely upon, to inform our public policies, that we can rely upon so that we can make the best decision for our kids for what kind of lives they want to lead. And right now, it's locked in madness. I mean, it's just madness.
It makes me, I love the fact that there's a very broad church of resistance to this stuff. So I'm like a bulldozer. I just go, it's a fucking lie. And that's what I do. And I love the fact that coming up from different angles is thought. But I need to ask you about the Socrates thing, because I don't care. So he said people never knowingly do bad things.
People don't knowingly do bad things. So my mentor said once, my mentor was a fascinating guy, Frank Wesley. He was picked up on Kristallnacht by the Nazis. He died at 95. He liberated the very same camp that he was interned, Buchenwald. And he was just an utterly remarkable man. I get to talk about him for hours, but he said, he did a guest lecture in my class once, and he said to the students, if I had your genes and your experience, I'd be sitting there with your legs folded, wearing what you're wearing, with your hands, with your what. And I'm not going to say that, free will is another idea, but people make the decisions that they make in part based upon the evidence they have, their psychological makeup, the communities in which they're a part. There are a lot of reasons, but almost always, like when you see these videos that I do, when I ask about trans women and women's sports, the people who think that trans women are in women's sports, some of those people believe that there are no physical differences between men and women. And the skulls, for example, if you look at the bones of men and women, people cannot tell the difference. Well, that's just not true. We know that from when pelvic exam. But it's just not true. But bracketing that for a moment, so you have to look at this problem in a moral lens. And the moment you look at this from a moral point of view, the whole thing becomes clear.
So where are we headed? Have you got some optimism?
I do. I think that the ideology is too idiotic to sustain itself.
It's unnatural, isn't it? It's something that's just trying to hold it together is so ridiculous. You just have to scream about it to make everyone pay attention. As you say, invent racists or invent Nazis.
Yeah, I tweeted it a few years ago, or I don't even know when I tweeted, but we went from millennia of pretending to know things we didn't know to very recently pretending to not know things we know. Right? So I'm an atheist, and so we went from pretending someone walked on water or someone flew to heaven in a winged horse. I don't know why I'm looking at you, but flew to heaven in a winged horse. Someone pretending something to now, we're pretending to not know what a woman is. We're pretending to not know what a man is. So here's a way to think about it. In the Bible, there's a passage of 1 Peter 3:15. It basically is given a gentle reason for your faith and what. That one passage for the Bible is probably, I'm not an intellectual historian, but my guess is that that's been responsible for the vibrancy and resilience and long staying power of Christianity, at least in part. The ideology in which we're currently facing has no 1 Peter 3:15. In fact, by its very design, no platforming, non-consensual, no platforming. They don't even want you to listen to the ideas of another argument. And when you can't listen to the ideas of another argument or another position, it is literally impossible to develop a defense of those ideas. There's no, in Greek, it's apologia. There's no, apologia is not an apology for the faith, it's a defense of the faith. There's no way to defend the ideology if you don't know what you're defending it against. And you just give a blanket, and that goes back to the evidence thing. If you don't have enough evidence, that's why, for example, in 11 Islamic countries, apostasy is punished by death with a Sharia law. That's because, and there's even a word for it, apostasy, which means leaving your faith. So there has to be some kind of blasphemy control or legal mechanism to enforce the ideology, because there's a misalignment for the evidence you have and the confidence you have. And as long as those are misaligned, they have to be made up somehow. So wokeism is unsustainable because it doesn't have an apologia. By definition, it cannot have an apologia. The ideology wouldn't function at all, because not having a way, not even listening to how an argument could be wrong, prevents the ideology from being dislodged. So we think about evolution in terms of adaptation to natural selection and circumstances, but there's a mimetic propagation of ideology. Richard Dawkins talks about this in The God Delusion. There's a mimetic propagation of ideology in which there's a kind of cognitive or epistemological colonization of one idea to another idea. And there is a kind of survival of the fittest in the meme world. And you have to have it. That is just not, it will burn itself out. It is simply unsustainable unless those memes are exposed. That there has to be some kind of an adversarial knocking of one meme against another meme to see which meme survive. So I don't think it's survivable. I don't think it's sustainable. Here's what I don't know. In fact, I'm positive. I don't know the expiration date. My guess is it's pretty soon. I mentioned before that I think the thing that's going to change it is our brains are not wired for peer-reviewed, double-blind placebo. Our brains are wired for testimony. I think one of the most important things to do is forward the testimonies of detransitioners, particularly children, and be just all they need. Literally, the only thing they need to do is be honest. That's it. And we have I'll call it a psychological industry at this point for gender-affirming care, and we need to talk openly and honestly about what that means, which is basically castration, chemical castration, and the drugs they give these kids. So I think that is going to help contribute to the fall of wokeness. What I don't know is I don't know the damage it's going to do to our institutions. My own personal opinion, and I've taken a lot of heat for this, I don't think that the universities and the institutions can be salvaged, and I want them all to crumble.
As you say, it's universal solvent. There's nothing there. It's just walls.
Yeah, and as I've said 5,000 times before, if you're genuinely serious about free speech, get rid of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. You have a choice. You have the Office of Free Speech. You have free speech, or you have the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And you can't have both. And you can claim that you want free speech all you want, but as long as that institution exists, or that mechanism to suspend or quell speech exists within an institution, there is no free speech. So my personal solution is to build new things. And if somebody else wants to spend there, and this guy over here, I don't know why people pick on him, he wants to spend his time building, trying to save the university and people in Oxford Free Speech, people want to do Toby Young. Yeah. They want to do it. I'm not going to see. That's, you pursue, live any type of life you want. I'm not going to wait for Chris Rufo to succeed. I'm just not going to do it. I'm going to build new institutions, and new institutions are going to emerge. It's that they're not anti-woke. They're based on excellence. Yeah. They're based on a meritocracy of a system of trying to falsify ideas by really smart people and bringing together sincere inquirers who have the tools to figure out maybe not what's true, that's probably overstating it, but certainly seeking truth, and certainly how to weed out things that are almost definitely false.
Well, also, it's not going to be long now, because as you say, these things have to butt together at some point. There has to be a hierarchy. It cannot exist without one. There's going to come a point when someone went, where do you go to university, in a job interview, and they went to Stanford, and they'll go, sorry, mate, I don't do Stanford guys. I do Hillsdale guys, or whoever, whatever.
It's already been the case. I know a lot of, I won't name their names, I know a lot of people, and they say if they see your pronouns, boom, you're out. They don't even look at you. And can't. And they see if Yale is topping the list, but Yale Law School is the top of the list, they simply won't hire people from Yale Law School. And why should they?
Well, exactly. It's because you're just hiring trouble. And someone who needs to create the intentional creation of tragedy.
Right. And there's another factor to this is we don't know that the people who are accepted there have been, well, in fact, we know that the people who have not been accepted there, who haven't been accepted there, are not accepted on the basis of merit, but some other exogenous characteristic. Yeah. And once that happens, you're then not training the best people for the positions. We also know that these are ideology mills that forward very particular conclusions. So it's not like you're training or you're teaching people. Dershowitz had an interesting thing about people not learning rape law anymore. But what happens if a woman, because they don't want to offend people, they don't want to trigger people? What happens about a woman who gets assaulted and she actually needs a lawyer who again, this is a cascading system-wide problem, and at the source of it is a single ideology that is uniquely malevolent.
Yeah. And as Heather McDonald in the I think I'm right with what she was saying, was when she said basically by messing around with the system and upping African Americans' SAT scores and downing Asian Americans and whites were sort of somewhere in the middle, then the African American students would flunk out of courses because they were on tougher courses. Then it's not that black people are any less bright than white people, but they were taking people who they'd flunk out the course, and then they invent more critical race theory because they're going, well, why are they falling out of the course? The course is racist. So it's sort of you're right. It's utterly malevolent. It's perpetuating, and hopefully it will just spin apart.
And what what are we not doing? We're not providing those kids, particularly those African American kids, and particularly poor kids, with a public education of the first rate. Yeah. Like that's John Rawls, the American philosopher. That's absolutely. I'm not saying it's the solution to the problem. I'm sure there are other solutions, like they have to have reasonable kinds of healthcare. We need to be we have to get over ideology. We have to get over this idea that, if I was going to say, we mentioned the criminogenic factors. It's age, it's male, and it's whether or not there's an adult male in the home. We have to get over the fact that this is a conservative thing.
Yeah.
We have to get beyond any ideology when people are talking about what's conservative and what's liberal. And I'd suggest to you, that's not the axis that's most relevant and pertinent that's going to lead to our flourishing. The axis right now that is most useful is talking and thinking about who were the authoritarians and who was not. Matt Walsh is clearly an authoritarian. I've invited him for a spirited conversation. Of course, he has not come. After he, quote unquote, said Peter Boghossian is canceled on his show. So we have authoritarians and we have non-authoritarians.
He's open about being an authoritarian, though, Matt. I think, isn't he? He's
not open about having a conversation. But hey, look.
Anyway, here goes. Yeah.
Just because it's me, I wouldn't have just invited him to a conversation and he started it, right?
Yeah.
But like he brought up my name and said that I should be canceled, and I gave a response, and of course he hasn't responded to that. But my larger point isn't about any one particular individual. It's that you have to be willing to step across a party line, like this whole child transition, in the same way that you should be willing to step up against, if somebody in the Labor or the Tories or whoever wants to take out pollution, plastic off your coast, you should say, hey, that's a good idea. Let's talk about the costs. I don't want in this. You have to be willing to step across the party lines. But I would suggest that a more useful access is who's an authoritarian and who's not an authoritarian. And what does that mean? And what role do they think cognitive liberty plays in one system?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the bits I think people have a problem with and why they get pushed towards conservatism is because their liberalism is bullied. But liberalism is one of the main... people call me very right-wing. I don't think I'm particularly right-wing at all. I think I'm much more liberal. I'm right-wing over some things. But once you're attacked, I can see why the authoritarians I wonder if it makes authoritarians or whether Matt Walsh is just a natural authoritarian. Look, we hate authoritarians of either political persuasion.
As well as there's a reason for that.
Because they end up killing people to make their point. As you say, the disparity between the ideology needs a punishment if you don't conform.
They want to take away your right to think, and that's the part of the perniciousness of woke, is that's part of the. But so here's something I've thought about, and just think a lot, if I may. So I don't believe that the parents who allow their children to be mutilated should go to prison. I do not believe that. I believe that they have been. I believe that they are not every much the victim, but they are in a sense victims of the ideology. They're epistemic victims, and they're victims of this derangement syndrome. The question, however, is I personally believe there should be some kind of accountability for physicians who perform these procedures.
I just said that.
Yeah, but I'm also going to extend that umbrella a little bit. I also believe that there should be a lesser, but some kind of severe punishment for hospital administrators who allow this procedure people under 18 in their hospitals.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I believe a parent could be completely brainwashed in the same way as I believe a child could be brainwashed. So
they don't need extra punishment in the fact on top of their kid.
Because then they do it secretly.
Already being mutilated, right? So they don't need to then go to prison and...
No, the doctors need to go. It needs to be made illegal. Gender transition, any form of, removal of bits of body parts as...
And putting kids on looping,
yeah.
the bindings,
Yeah, just 18. I think that we kind of agree. It's
so, people are really upset at the whole Target thing. The tucking.
Yeah.
I don't find any problem with that.
Oh God.
As long as it's not marketed to kids, I don't have any problem with that.
But it is marketed to kids, isn't it?
Well, if it were, that's the problem.
I think the point is I think this, like, I think it was probably Matt Walsh actually was saying it the other day, or Stephen Crowder or someone was saying, was it the fact that we let gay people get married? Is that where all of this started? And that's, it's quite, but you see, the right can do the clever things that the woke can do as well. They turn around and go, you see, we gave it away. It's their excuse to go, we should never have allowed same-sex marriage. And if we hadn't allowed same-sex marriage, the left wouldn't have asked for more. The woke left wouldn't have asked for more. And now we've got transgender children. They're sexualizing our kids. It's kind of, we got to, as you say, just let's stand against authoritarianism, authoritarian thinking and all that. Peter Boghossian, that is my favourite chat I've ever had on doing this. Thank you so much. Brilliant.